Well, good morning, people in India, and good evening, people in the US and the Western Europe. Thanks for joining again. Today is the last and the 10th lecture session of our 10 lecture series. It's very fascinating and really we are learning a lot. And also very importantly, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we are experiencing the very difficult time of our generation. It's very much true. So far, 3.1 million people affected across the world with a death toll of 224,000, which is unprecedented and which we not heard in our lifetime, like last 60, 70 years. US alone, those who are affected are 1.05 million and more than 60,000 deaths. Certain points are very clear because of the COVID-19 pandemic. One is definitely this much of calamity would have been definitely avoided if the state has acted in a proper way. And also it has exposed some of the ruling class and their governments, their inability and their political unwillingness to control the spread of the virus. And second thing, on the positive side, it enables the people, especially the working class and the people, those who suffer from the social and other oppressions. It enables them to be familiar with the many technical tools that like online meetings and other means of communication, which is very important for them. And many people are now, the people from the common folks of life, the working class and other suppressed class of people, they are using Go Meeting, Zoom, the Google, WebEx, and some people, those who are very concerned about their privacy and security, they are using Jitsi Meet and all. So it's Jitsi is a completely free software, and this pandemic enabled the people to be careful when they are communicating with their own organizations. And if this pandemic would have taken place like 15 years before, we don't think so that it would have been a possibility. Perhaps the humankind would have invented some mass communication tool which we can communicate with each other. And also, because of this pandemic, we have an opportunity to organize such a month-long online session where we have our comrade Geetha available for this. Because the subject that we are dealing with, we have very less resources to talk on these subjects. We have always a resource crunch. When you talk on Ambedkar holistically, there are people, but not as many as we have. And such a subjective subjects to be taught very clearly and to explain the dispositions of Ambedkar in a historical context is really challenging. And so far we have seen that Comrade Geetha has done a great justice to that. And I'd like to tell an example that about the mass communication and the resource crunch. It happened in Russia also, followed by the revolution. Even after the revolution, Russia was not completely free from the idea of the bourgeois. Especially the professors, those who are teaching social sciences in the Russian universities, they are predominantly inclined to the idea of bourgeois. And there are very few lecturers, those who understand the Marxist philosophy and they can educate the toiling masses, especially the proletariat, those who are still emancipated, because Russia was still in the civil war till 1922. After the November revolution of 1970, there are 6 years of civil war which lost till 1922. So that time the party is not able to send so many learned Marxist scholars, especially the academicians, to all the places. It's not at all possible. That is the time Lenin found one very interesting guy. His name is Bong Borevik, that he himself worked in the imperial army in the radio technology. But after the revolution, he understood this revolution is benefiting all the toiling masses, and he expressed his interest to fully develop this radio technology and approached people's commissars and especially Lenin. And Lenin immediately grabbed this idea and wrote to Stalin and other commissars of labor that immediately allocate 100,000 rubles for his technology, for develop this technology fully, and to build radio stations across Russia. That time till the USSR has to be born, so it was still Russia. And followed by that, Borevik took the research and he built the 40 kilowatt vacuum radio stations, which come into existence for in 24 radio stations they form. And Lenin called them as paperless newspapers. And that is how the whole propaganda of the the socialist Russia was started. So we are a very important time that how the means of communication has to be owned and controlled by the working class. And as far as today's lecture is concerned, it is again a very very interesting and meanwhile very in-depth one, because we are going to deal with religion. Ambedkar is very clear. This oppression comes from many spheres. What he writes, as he writes in the Annihilation of Caste, he writes, religion, social status, and property are all sources of power and authority, which one man has to control the liberty of another. One is predominant at one stage, the other is predominant at another stage. That's what Ambedkar writes in Annihilation of Caste. And when throughout the introduction of the first couple of chapters in the Annihilation of Caste, he very carefully deals that emancipation of mind and soul is necessary and the prerequisite for the political expansion of the people, which very likely sounds with the Hegel's philosophy of mind, objective and subjective. Hegel, in his famous speech when he gives in his university, introducing the history of philosophy, Hegel says, the love of truth, faith in the power of mind is the first condition in the philosophy. Man, because he is mind, should and must deem himself worth of the highest. That's what Hegel says. Then Marx comes and says the mind is not independent. It is the creation of the state and the manifestation of the state. And this is where the Marx differ from Hegel's the subjective and objective. But he accepted the dialectics. That is what that we are going to deal with. What Ambedkar, how Ambedkar approached Buddhism. He writes in Annihilation of Caste, he wants a social reform before the political revolution, where he mentions the Chandragupta Maurya's revolution followed by the Buddha and the Guru Nanak's one. Guru Nanak, he mentioned about Guru Nanak. And also Hegel mentions the same, that when the one dynasty of China is overthrown by the other dynasty, it is because of the moral philosophy of the Confucius. So this is the historical context that we are going to deal with today's subject also. It's not as a matter of religious text, the Buddha and his Dhamma. It is primarily a text which gives the Indians or the so-called oppressed people of non-Savarna or the Bahujans that you should have a mental power which invested in the religious text. And I would like to leave here and request Comrade Geetha to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik, and thank you, Kanak. I always mean to thank you, but I somehow slips my mind. We will come straight away to the Buddha and his Dhamma, but just very briefly, those of you who were there in the last lecture would have sort of noted that I pointed out that alongside Ambedkar's political, social, and economic concerns, they ran that very distinctive thread of attending to consciousness, to what makes consciousness, to religion, to custom, to what he called mental habitude, to the role of Hinduism as it had evolved in the modern period, and what that did to our mental makeup and what that did to our relationships with each other. And he was very concerned that changes effected in the domains of politics or economics would never be entirely sufficient to transform the social order. And increasingly in the 1940s, he spoke of the need for constitutional morality, of public conscience, of the need to develop a new ethical moral order in the social sphere, which would sustain and keep alive democratic institutions, democratic practice, and how the democratic practice has to seep into life, into every sphere of human activity. So these were lifelong concerns, and I think the path that led him to conversion was a very long one. since his announcement in 1936. He took 2 decades to actually reach that goal. And once he reached that goal, I don't think he sought to rest there. Didn't perhaps imagine that conversion would address all these problems, all of them at one go, but he saw it as a very crucial moment from which you needed to look at everything else that was important for the making of a just, democratic society. So, and as I pointed out, the Buddha and his Dhamma was written towards the very end of his life. He'd been working on it for quite a while. And the text, as I noted, is in English, which meant that it was not just meant to be read by those who took on Diksha along with him and who converted to Buddhism, because many of them, being Dalits at that point in time, might not have been able to access the English text. But that he also meant it for the rest of society. Why? In some ways for the entire world, because he conceived of Buddhism as a world religion, and it was an important aspect of life and politics and the state in much of Southeast Asia, starting from Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Korea, Japan, parts of China. So he did see it as a great civilizational force as it existed in these parts of the world. And he also saw his own propounding of the Buddha's creed as departing from the more conventional, from the more canonical manner in which Buddhism was presented, practiced, systematically organized. So I think the text was important for him for all these very many reasons. And I just want to point out one thing before I get on to the text, which is that sad, and this is one of the saddest features of Indian modern life, that the 2500th anniversary of the Buddha's presence in the Indian subcontinent was celebrated with great aplomb by the Indian state, presided by no less than a person like Jawaharlal Nehru. And even in spite of the fact Ambedkar had been talking about Buddhism, working constantly at his texts, he was not invited to be part of the official celebrations. And I think that says something about how the Indian state tried to assimilate and adapt some of the more important aspects of, symbolic aspects of Buddhism into its own political and state-making concerns, starting from, of course, the chakra, the Dhamma chakra, the Ashokan lions, and the whole doctrine of ahimsa, which they proclaimed was very much part of how India would like to sort of define its activities towards the rest of the world. Now, all of this becomes important in light of how we might read the Buddha and his Dhamma, that it is also a text that wants us to rethink some of the aspects of Buddhist thought in a world historical sense, in a regional sense, in a national sense, and of course in the sense of what it means to be a human person who does not want to live within the confines of the Hindu social order, as he called it. So now, to come to the text, I mean, I can wax eloquent on the text as text for hours. And being a student of English literature, I will have a lot to say about language, about genre, about many, many things that are fascinating. But of course, we won't have time to go into all those details now. But as a text, it's a very, very amazing achievement. Ambedkar himself was very modest. He said, I am not saying anything that hasn't been said before. In the preface to the text, he says, this is an assemblage. The word he uses is assemblage. I have put together things from different sources. But I think one shouldn't be fooled by that modesty, because the assembling is of crucial importance. What does he deem important? What does he take from which source? Why for the same incident, the same aspects of that particular incident, different aspects, sorry, of that particular incident, he draws one part from one text and another part from another text. So the assemblage is not something that is unthought of. It's actually very mindful. It's very deliberate, and he's constructed this amazing architecture of thought. And I'm sure he would have revised it even further had he been well and had he had time to live longer. But even as it exists, it's a considerable sort of assembling that has happened here, a very amazing, brilliant sort of assembling that we see that has happened with the making of the Buddha and his Dhamma. And I just want to read out something about why he thought he had to do what he did. And this is from the text itself, and it's a section called What the Buddha Taught. And he says there have been many attempts to understand the Buddha, many points of view, and he actually lists all of them. He says to some it is an esoteric religion, to some it is only vipassana, to some it is samadhi, and he goes on. I mean, this is what people have had to say about Buddhism. For some, it is just a sort of another aspect of Hindu thought. They were assimilated into Hinduism. But he says the important thing for him is that does the Buddha speak to society? Does it speak to all of us as a social group, to the social relationships that we have instituted and so on? And therefore, does this Buddha have a message? Does the Buddha have a social message? And he says, people usually answer this by saying the Buddha taught ahimsa, the Buddha taught peace, but he himself is not happy with those responses. So he wants to sort of go on and ask other questions which are rarely asked, he says, with response to what the Buddha taught. And what are these questions? Did the Buddha teach justice? Did the Buddha teach love? Did the Buddha teach liberty? Did the Buddha teach equality? Did the Buddha teach fraternity? And importantly, the last question is, could the Buddha answer Karl Marx? Now, that's an interesting thing to put along with those other things, because clearly Karl Marx, Marxism, socialism, the Soviet state, the emergence of a sort of red politics in Southeast Asia. Let's not forget, these were the early days of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Burma had a very strong communist movement. There were incipient communist groups in Thailand. And Ambedkar was watching all these developments. And of course, there was a Chinese Revolution in 1949. So there was a sense of Marxism as an Asian phenomenon, not simply as a Soviet phenomenon. So, and not willing to put by Marxism, but at the same time very critical of Marxism as it had historically evolved in parts of the world, and with the manner in which Marxism had been sort of worked through as a set of irrefutable dogma in the Indian left especially, but at the same time not willing to commit himself to any of these Marxisms, but concerned about socialism as doctrine, as the possibilities of a new just society. Ambedkar wanted the Buddha to answer to Karl Marx, just as he wanted Karl Marx to be integrated within a Buddhist framework. And I'm being very clear here, he meant Marxism and Karl Marx, not the particular practice of Marxism as it had evolved in different parts of the world. So I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, because he says these are questions that are hardly ever raised in discussing the Buddha's Dhamma. My answer, and I'm quoting him, is that the Buddha has a social message. He answers all these questions and so on. So he was very clear that his text has to be read alongside with that of Karl Marx. Now, how we make that relationship between Marx and Buddha is up to us. But Ambedkar certainly wanted a relationship to be established between these two traditions of thought. So keeping that in mind, I will get into the text as such now. And the text is very rich, it's very long, so I'm not, of course, going to go chapter by chapter. That's impossible, I won't have the time. But I do want to point to some very important innovations that Ambedkar brings into his reading of the Buddha's life. And I say this because Buddhism was not absent from the Indian intellectual world of the 1900s or even earlier. The tradition of thinking about Buddhism in the modern period, of course, goes back to the 19th century. And that's a fascinating history in itself, how Buddhism emerged as an earlier civilizational aspect of Indian history. Lots of reasons: the collection of texts, the making of a canon, the discovery of Buddhist ruins, the Western interest in Buddhism, British interest apart from European interest, the reconstruction of aspects of the Buddha's thought world through the Rice Davis, through Carolyn Rice Davis and Rice Davis, Max Muller's own work, the creation of the Buddhist texts through bringing them into a sort of modern canon, the Pali canon, which was translated into English. So a number of developments happened during that time. But as importantly, Buddhism was seen as a way of also countering the caste order by lots of people within India, not just scholars, not just historians, but people who felt Buddhism answered to some of the things that they found problematic with the caste order, including Vittal Rao Shinde from Maharashtra. And of course, the earliest was Ayotitas from the Tamil context, Rahul Sankrityayan from the North Indian context, Kausalyayan also from the North Indian context, and Haraprasad Shastri from Bengal, scholars from Odisha, writers, even a writer like Kumaran Asan from Kerala. So there's any number of people who were thinking through Buddhism as a possible counter, as a civilizational counter to Brahmanism, to Hinduism as it had evolved. And Ambedkar himself followed these developments. He was familiar with this literature. So anyone who goes to his personal library in Siddhartha College, Mumbai, will see what a huge collection of Buddhist texts he had assembled and he was working through. And one text, of course, by his own admission, was very important, which was Professor Lakshminarasu from Madras, The Essence of Buddhism. Lakshminarasu was, of course, a teacher of science, a man who was invested in modern science, who had kept in touch with important modern scientists of his time, including Ernest Mach, who himself had been interested in Buddhism earlier. So I think Ambedkar sort of was very aware of this conversation between Buddhism and modern science that had emerged in different parts of the world. So he draws on all of these things. But I think what you see in the text more than anything else is his great familiarity with both the Buddha Charita, the Sanskrit canon, including the Lalita Vistara, and the crucial text of the Pali canon. He quotes very widely from all of them. And as I said, now we have a very important annotated version edited by Akash Singh Rathore and Ajay Varma, who have built on the earlier scholarship of Christopher Emmerich and Adele Fiske. So you have this, you can actually line by line trace where Ambedkar has taken from which source. And that is what makes his assembling of these texts fascinating. So what did Ambedkar do having assembled these texts together? And I think his innovations were very crucial in 2 or 3 areas. One is, of course, the central teachings of Buddhism itself. Let's start with Siddhartha's going into exile. Siddhartha getting away from his father's palace. And as you know the story, I'm not going to go into the Buddha's life. He led a very protected life because his father had heard he would either become a Chakravarti or he would become an ascetic. So to protect him from being an ascetic, he's kept at home and all of that. And then he goes out, he sees these sights, he's very unhappy, and unhappiness, sorrow, old age, suffering. And then he leaves home. This is a story that we all know. Now, Ambedkar is not satisfied with those reasons for the Buddha seeking to go away and to ask questions about what is the meaning of life, how do we make sense of suffering. So you have a very important episode that Ambedkar builds on, which is there in actually Dharmananda Kosambi's writings on Bhagwan Buddha, and which Ambedkar was familiar with, which is that Ambedkar as Buddha leaves his home because he has a dissenting opinion to voice during a discussion on a water sharing conflict with the Sakyas and the Kolis get into an argument about water sharing. He has a dissenting opinion to offer, and he says if the others don't agree with him, especially because the argument is that if the Buddha's point of view is to prevail, then that's fine. But if the others disagree with it, they will hold his family and community as hostage to his opinion. So he doesn't want that situation to arise, and he leaves home. So he leaves home as a Democrat, and that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. Somebody who honors the democratic verdict, but who's not satisfied, therefore, with the answer that has been given. And then he goes out, and then Ambedkar's text follows the text that is there in the canon, that Ambedkar gets into the various sorts of exercises that he finds people around him doing, starving himself, not eating, and all of that. And then he enters the state of enlightenment, and then he wishes to share what he has acquired with the rest of the world. And that's important because if you read that along with Ambedkar's concern about the Brahmins being just an educated class and not an intellectual class, therefore the whole aspect of sharing this knowledge of enlightenment becomes a very profoundly anti-Brahminic gesture, that you will not keep back anything to yourself. Knowledge, enlightenment is not a monopoly of one class, which is also why he's very uneasy with the vanguardist notion that the party can perhaps lead, but it has to persuade, it has to argue, it has to debate its point of view. So read along with all of this, his act of wanting to share what he has learned through meditation becomes very, very important. And then, of course, you have the first preaching to the men he had known earlier. And that is very important because Ambedkar's reworking of the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. What causes suffering? Suffering is an important aspect of human life. What causes suffering? How do you get rid of suffering? How do you liberate yourself from suffering? These are the 4 noble truths, so to speak, in Buddhism. Even our textbooks in school tell us this. These are the 4 truths of Buddhism. But Ambedkar glosses these truths in a completely different manner from what you find in canonical Buddhist texts. For one, he glosses dukkha in a very interesting way. He gives you a prehistory of dukkha. He says in the earlier understanding of dukkha, it's not simply sorrow. It's also commotion, uneasiness, unsettling, conflict. Dukkha is also all of that in earlier writings. And after the Buddhist intervention, sorrow and suffering get added to the understanding of dukkha. So in his own sense, in his own reconstruction of dukkha, and his own Buddha talks of dukkha as something that emerges out of conflict. And that conflict is not simply a conflict between classes. And this again, he reworks what is already there in the canon. It's a conflict that exists at every level in society, in the social sphere, cultural sphere, in the family, in human relationships. And what is this conflict? And at one level, and here he will cite the Mahanidana Sutta, it is a conflict that comes out of private property. It is about those that have property, those who wish to guard property, those who do not want to pass on property to anyone outside their circle, and possession leads to avarice, and avarice leads to controlling access to property. So avarice leads to what Ambedkar, quoting the Mahanidana Sutta, calls watch and ward, to security, to policing, to the state. So he draws a line between private property and the state as a guardian of the interests of property. And then he says, once you have that situation, you will have a conflict. This is a political economy of property itself. And that conflict is kept going because of the securitized state. And therefore, that is a cause of suffering, of sorrow. So that is at one level. At another level, you also have a conflict coming from how you are as a person, how you've been raised, your social and historical disposition, how you have evolved, what are you a part of, what do you inherit from your community, from society, how are your social dispositions shaped by what he earlier had called mental habitude. So that then becomes a sort of psychological understanding of dukkha, whereas at one level it is a political economic understanding. Then you have a psychological / let's say existential understanding of dukkha, where you suffer because of this weight of history on you, because all this is bearing down on how you behave. And that also causes conflict and suffering. Then the third thing is that very many things that bring about the situation, private property or historical disposition, and the the causation, what causes dukkha in a large sense is also the actions that we all perform as being part of a social whole. And these actions have effects. So just as you saw, you read Buddha quotes the New Testament, Ambedkar's Buddha quotes the New Testament, and then dependent causation. Many things are linked together and cause this suffering. And you need to understand it in its complexity. And I think Ambedkar was very concerned about the understanding of causation, because in classic Buddhist texts, causation had been linked to karma, and karma had been linked to rebirth, that you suffer not only because of what has happened to you, but also because of the weight of what happened to you in previous births. Now, Ambedkar, of course, disagrees with the idea of rebirth, but he retains the idea of karma, of the line of causation. So he says that whatever you do affects other human beings in a very consequential sort of way. So I think mindfulness, the way you relate to each other, social relationships, as much as economic arrangements, as much as the state, as much as your own personal disposition, which is shaped by history in any case, the causation that we bring about in this universe because of the way we behave, and all of which then has a social sort of impact, these also produce dukkha or suffering. And this is an argument actually which he takes from Lakshmi Narasu, who argues it out at great length. So I would urge you to read The Essence of Buddhism, which is a very important text to understand Ambedkar himself. So you have this very complex understanding of dukkha. So in keeping with this complex understanding, dukkha as suffering, which is brought about by conflict, by human relationships to each other, by the weight of history, then what is dukkha nivarana? What will then end the suffering? So this becomes very important, right? What causes suffering is complex. What is suffering is complex, but then what will bring about this suffering? And here, of course, Ambedkar does not preach a simple one sort of argument as to what will end the suffering. And he has many, many things that he brings into his understanding. And the way he works with something like the important fire sermon in Buddhism is quite fascinating. The fire sermon is very central to many canonical Buddhist texts. But Ambedkar sort of integrates this with a larger argument about what will end suffering. And here he says that there are three things that he wants us to pay attention to. One is, of course, suffering is endless. But on the other hand, the Buddha also says nothing is permanent. Now, how do you read that? So nothing is permanent, including the idea of impermanence itself, right? So what you think is forever is not going to last forever. What you think will not last forever is also not permanent. So it's a very complex philosophical understanding of permanence and impermanence. And the Buddha in his own time was charged with an annihilationist doctrine that, nothing can be made to work, that this can lead to pessimism. If nothing is permanent, if nothing is impermanent, then what is the meaning of life itself? Now, Ambedkar, being the sort of thinker he is, he says that if nothing is permanent, and if impermanence itself is impermanent, that doesn't mean that you give in to pessimism or that you give in to a hedonism, that, whatever goes. Rather, you see that this is an opportunity at every point in your life, in your existence, in your history, to think of change, to think of the possibility of hope. So hope is therefore given a sort of philosophical importance, that change and hope are very, very important, because you can constantly renew hope. You can constantly rethink, what does it mean to be part of this world? What does it mean to renew your approach to suffering? So he therefore rethinks sunyata itself, the idea of nothingness or of emptiness, of this thing that is there, which is sort of what we cannot grasp, but which we try to grasp through making some things permanent, making some things impermanent. But for Ambedkar, that is the source of hope itself. So that's one important thing that he offers in this text. The other thing that he also offers is, how do you then sort of start to live? If this is hope, how do you then live? What is the revolution that you need to effect in your personal, social, economic, and other lives? And here I think comes the most delicate part of Ambedkar's teachings, which is, how do you read the three important aspects of Buddhist thought, which is the Ashtanga Marga, or the Eightfold Path, the things that stop you from pursuing the Eightfold Path, and how do you then build a just society based on the Eightfold Path? So these are the challenges that he sets himself and us. And as you know, the Eightfold Path, again, this is part of our textbooks, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but the way he interprets them, the language that he uses to explain the Eightfold Path, that is singularly Ambedkar's own sort of innovation, in that he brings his earlier interventions in the political, social, and state building spheres to bear on the Eightfold Path. So when you look at something like, say, the right view, which is one of the most important things, samaditi, the right view, he glosses it as critical moral consciousness. So you ought to sort of examine things in the light of thought to have the right view. So that is, of course, his sort of lifelong endeavor. How do you make thought central to social change? So samaditi becomes, or the right view becomes, critical moral consciousness. And what does it mean to then draw on right thought? How do you sort of know what is right and wrong in this thing? It's a philosophical question, and it's a question that has to do with, how do you understand right and wrong from different points of view? The Marxists, especially Trotsky, of whose writings Ambedkar was familiar, because Trotsky was defended by John Dewey in the United States, would say that class morality is important, that morality emerges out of class struggle. But for Ambedkar, this whole thing of the right thought or the right action actually also has to do with the knowledge of what you ought not to do, what is actually wrong as well. So if injustice is wrong, if depriving your fellow human being of her or his right to a life of just work, of just economic existence, if you actively work against that, you must have a knowledge of that. So right thought and right action also depends on a critical understanding of injustice, of wrongdoing. So this is also something that Ambedkar wants us to understand. And therefore, when you think of right thought, you have to cultivate it. And cultivation requires a critical knowledge of wrongdoing, of social evil, of injustice. And right action, likewise, is not simply that of a child. A child does things without consciousness, so to speak. So it is not the innocence of the child that he has in mind, but the conscious choice of what is right and putting by what is wrong. And here, it has also to do with how you live, how you arrange your economic life, and there justice becomes very important. You don't do injury to another being, to another human being. You don't do injury to social relationships in ways that would separate you and make you an object, make you a pursuer of avarice, of greed. So livelihood becomes very important, and then you keep at it, you struggle. As we know, for Ambedkar, struggle was a very central aspect of his own life. Ceaseless struggle was what he had to undertake at every point in his life, and he counsels this as a strategy to the Dalit Bahujans also. Don't imagine life is going to be easy. So right endeavor, right effort becomes very, very important, and mindfulness, therefore, that you're mindful at every stage. And the important last Ashtanga Marga, which is Samadhi, or right concentration, he's very clear. He doesn't understand this to mean just meditation or just sitting by thinking and letting go of things. As he often points out, even when he talks about the ideal bhikkhu, it is not meditation, it is not self-cultivation alone which will achieve this. It is also actively wanting to be out of social suffering, out of the situation that has been created. So his gloss of the Ashtanga Marga, which you can read across the text, at different points he comes to a very complex understanding, then sort of makes the individual responsible in ways that don't devolve on our individuality alone, but which makes the individual a conscious, critical, responsible social being. So once you become that responsible social being, you cannot exist as a social being by yourself. You have to be in relationship to other social beings. So the aspect of that relationship becomes important to Ambedkar, which is what he then brings into his argument about the 10 virtues, or the 10 paramitas as they are called in Buddhism. Again, very importantly here is knowledge, which is pradanya, which is glossed as pradanya in Buddhism. But he says knowledge alone is not going to be important, because what will you do with that knowledge? You know, as Marx said, it's not enough to just be a philosopher. You know, the point is to change the world. So knowledge has to be leavened by the 10 virtues. And your behavior, your Ashtanga Marga has to keep in mind, these are the things that are important. And so therefore Sila, which is the practice of the good life. Dana, which is what you do with property, becomes very important, that you rethink property itself, you rethink distribution itself. You speak the truth in a way that you are not giving into other kinds of circumstantial influences. You make sure that you're steadfast, you're strong, therefore virya, kanti. But at the same time, you occupy a position where you're not easily swayed by popular, public, or prejudice, which is of course upeka, and also nekama, which is a kind of staying apart from the world while staying in the world, where you don't let. In our own time, this would be not to be sort of perhaps drawn into what appear very easy, immediately politically correct projects, but to stand back and rethink also what it means to be part of this or that project. And aditana, which is determination. But then I think the most important of the paramitas, apart from all of this, how you cultivate your disposition, is how you relate to others. And there are two things that Ambedkar talks about, which is karuna and maitri. So you go to the section on what is sadhamma in Buddha and is Dhamma, and you will see that karuna is of course important, compassion for the world. But his very important statement, greater than karuna, is maitri. Because maitri is a broader social fellowship, which you then institute with each other and the rest of the world itself, whether it's plant, animal life, the environment. You also are very mindful of how you're linked to all these things. So these become very important too. And I think Ambedkar charges us to pursue the Ashtanga Marga, not just for self-cultivation, but also for how we then relate to others, and how we relate to others has to be based on extremely mindful, compassionate grounds. Compassion is not charity, compassion is not condescension, but it's a sort of wellspring of goodwill towards the rest of the world. And this is where Ambedkar also redefines ahimsa. He says ahimsa is not simply non-killing. Non-killing is a doctrine that the Jains actually put forth. The Buddhist notion of ahimsa is positively doing good. It's not simply non-killing. And he also distinguishes between the need to kill and the will to kill. So the need to kill is something that emerges out of your environment. You are alone. The early human societies had a need to kill for whatever reasons. But the will to kill is very different, because that's an act of choice. And that's something that Ambedkar would want to guard against, and he would consider as the will to kill as far more problematic than the need to kill, and he would rework that in a very interesting way in his understanding of the state itself, to which I'll come to in a minute. So I think this whole doctrine of ahimsa is also reworked very, very considerably in Ambedkar's understanding of the paramitas, of the Ashtanga Marga and all of that. It is a positive good that you need to seek to do. Now, who is going to be doing all of this? These are moral virtues, ethical virtues that we as a people need to cultivate. But what about those who govern us, those we choose to govern us, either through a revolution or through a democracy, those that govern, those that form the state? What is the state to do? And Ambedkar's understanding of the state is very interesting, because the Buddhist state, if you are to even speak of a Buddhist state, and today we have a very problematic sense of the Buddhist state from South and Southeast Asia, but Ambedkar's own ideal state was, of course, the Ashokan state. And we can talk about that during question hour if you like, but basically, what is the attitude of the state? The state has to abide by the Ashtanga Marga, by the paramitas. The state has to do good. The state has to be mindful. The state has to not sort of cultivate the logic of private property. The state has to create distributive justice. We know all this from Ambedkar's other writings. But very importantly, the state's attitude towards justice. And here we know from Buddha, our Karl Marx, that Ambedkar felt that the state cannot sort of not legislate against wrong, against evil, and even concedes that a dictatorship, a proletarian dictatorship, might be desirable in the short run if you had to bring about change. Because he doesn't think that a violent situation can continue to remain that way, an unjust situation can be left that way without it being challenged. And sometimes, because the terms of history are already set, you might need to have a moment of violence even in challenging that. But having challenged that and having acquired power, how do you sort of practice justice? And here Ambedkar talks of how the state has to legislate against wrongdoing, against evil, against private property perhaps, against different forms of ill will that already exists in society. But that form of justice has to be done in a spirit of non-bitterness. There must be punitive action, but it does not have to have hatred. This is something that's so important in our context, where punitive action comes completely accompanied by hatred, ill will, by continuous cultivation of othering of those we consider wrongdoers, where punishment is constantly attended to by what you call a spirit of vengeance. You know, we've seen that in India and perhaps in other parts of the world. So I think justice has to be accompanied by a sense of non-bitterness, of a sense of non-ill will. And I think he charges the state with a very lofty ethical standpoint, which I'm not sure modern states are capable of the way they exist at present. But I think that whole ethical charge he places on the state is something that he sees as possible because of the example of Ashoka and what happened to Ashoka after the Kalinga War and so on. Historians might agree, disagree with his view of Ashoka, but he imagines that the Ashokan state moved out of violence and punitive action to a just legal order where justice was secured through these various other means. So there is all of that. Then the other thing is, of course, and this is where the Buddha and his Dhamma becomes very interesting. So how do we practice all of these things? Do we do them as individuals? Do we do them as a group? And here Ambedkar talks of the importance of the Sangha. What is the Sangha enjoined to do? And the Sangha is a very interesting organization as far as we are concerned, because Ambedkar clearly sees that as being in some ways like, you know, a political party, a political group, perhaps like a vanguardist group, but not being sort of completely in charge of how do you present a point of view. Point of view can be presented by the vanguard, but the vanguard has to be ready for dialogue. So the Sangha is envisaged by him precisely as such an organization. In fact, calls it a missionary organization. And the Buddha and his Dhamma actually also has a great deal of the New Testament in it. So he calls it a missionary organization. He calls it a torchbearer. These are his own words. And he says, why do you need a Sangha? Because he feels that society needs the guidance of a class that has itself learned certain important things and which will communicate it to the outside world. And here we see Ambedkar, the pedagogue, the teacher, who was invested in education, like Dewey, who felt that the pedagogic aspects of society are not given the importance and weightage that they deserve, that you need to constantly be there to communicate, to make available knowledge, not because you know it all, but because you've had the opportunity to arrive at this knowledge. So therefore, you permanently persuade, to use Ramshi's term, others of what you think is right, but with this injunction that you are always prepared to rethink and revisit your own position should a contrary powerful argument come in your way. So the bhikkhus are charged with this missionary activity, and he says they have to go and seek out people, not sit in their monasteries, and they have to convert yet. That's the word he uses, call people into the path, into Dhamma, but with this understanding that the Dhamma is a dynamic principle. Dhamma is not settled forever. So, and then the bhikkhu is, of course, a torchbearer and so on. And he makes it very clear that it's not enough for a bhikkhu to rest with vipassana and self-cultivation. In fact, to quote him, he says, you can't have a bhikkhu being just indifferent to the woes of humankind, however perfect in self-culture. So self-culture as an aspect of Buddhism is, of course, something that has become very attractive to a certain strain of Buddhism, to especially form of Western Buddhism to some extent, but also here, detached from its social and historical context, as Ambedkar and certain others have viewed it. For Ambedkar himself, that would be a problem. Self-cultivation without attending to the suffering of humankind, attending to social suffering is not something he would countenance in his own Navayana as a way to go forward with Buddhism. So I think the charges the Sangha, therefore, with that sort of missionary zeal to convert, with a certain openness, a certain being available, not owning private property, being dependent on civil society, because the Sangha has to receive alms. Now, will that make the Sangha a captive to those that can give it more alms? Which is where then Ambedkar comes back to the Vinaya, the rules that govern the Sangha. And what are these rules? And Ambedkar lists them all from the canon, and he says these rules are important not because they are important in themselves, they are means towards an end. And he says, while the precepts, the Buddhist precepts, the Ashtanga Marga, the way you understand suffering, the way you understand emancipation are the same for all of us, whether you are a a monk, the laity, so to speak, or whether you're a monk. But the Vinaya is specific to the Sangha, because the Vinaya, or the path of cultivating yourself to be a bhikkhu, is very necessary to form a restrained, reflective, and disciplined workforce. You can't be an organization without restraint and discipline. And this is something that all organizers of the left would agree with. A party cannot function as a free-for-all institution. It has to have protocols to deal with arguments. You can have arguments, you can fight, and you can have different points of view. But Lenin, of course, instituted democratic centralism as a way of dealing with different points of view and as what point of view ought to prevail. Now, we may agree with that, we may not agree with it, but all of us would certainly agree organizations need restraint, discipline, and a way of thinking through different points of view. And I think for Ambedkar, the Vinaya was exactly that. And he, of course, reinterprets the Vinaya in interesting ways. So therefore, for him, you have these three levels at which the Dhamma has to be understood. And I'm just summarizing now, which is that the first level is at the level of how we understand the paramitas, Ashtanga Marga. How do we fight against all that comes in the way of stopping us from following this mindful doctrine, stopping us from actually practicing social relationships in a certain way, of relationships of property in a certain way. How do we work against that? And what do we owe each other, the law of karma, and how do we relate to each other, which is karuna and maitri? And how does the state incorporate these ideals as precepts? How does the state practice these doctrines? And what then sort of mediates between society and the state, persuading either, as happened in the Ashokan period, is of course the Sangha. So I think he has a very complex picture here that he wants us to look at and take seriously as we address the problem of social suffering. Now, to come back to how I started this whole placing of the text in a larger context of Ambedkar's life work, his thought world, is that this text cannot be read apart from other texts. That's one thing. The second thing is that the Dhamma cannot be seen as something that is sort of just a matter of self-cultivation, though self-cultivation is an important part of it. the Dhamma also has to be seen in the context of all that Ambedkar wished to do in the political and social and economic spheres as well. So you cannot sort of separate this text from all his other writings and read it only as something that is final. Of course, it's final in the sense that it's what he has left us with as a kind of completed text, and he didn't live on for very long after that. But knowing Ambedkar's own response through his years, many years that he was active, the Buddha and his Dhamma is a very important point of arrival. But for Ambedkar, it could have well also been a point of departure into other kinds of things he might have said. So if you are to think in philosophical terms, he's left us with an ethics, but he also left us with a certain approach to politics, a certain approach to economics. And from the point of view of the Dhamma that he expounds in this text, it's very likely that he would have gone and reworked his own vision of politics and economics as well. So I think these are things that we need to kind of keep in mind when we come to this absolutely astounding and fascinating text, and see the sort of immense task that he set himself and us. How do you work a philosophical, ethical tradition to recognizably modern purpose? Where in the modern world, the state is an important part of our lives, where class society is something that we can't get away from. It's very much part of what we are. But in the Indian context, all of this is structured through graded inequality and untouchability and a politics of gender, a politics of reproduction. So to rework all of this into an argument for a different social way of being, or being Dhamma, Maitri. So to connect Maitri to what we started with, that this is a society that lives on fortification, enclosure, hatred, mistrust, graded inequality. So unless you have a comprehensive philosophy of Maitri, you cannot begin to address any of these aspects on their own. So I think for him, therefore, Maitri as this fellowship, as what we human beings do together in a spirit of openness, reflection, rationality, bound by relationships of critical affection, these become very, very important. So therefore, let's think of the Buddha and his Dhamma as both a point of arrival, which looks backwards to what he's done, and forwards to what else one might do with Ambedkar's fantastic, creative, and absolutely central legacy to our existence as a people in the modern period in India and perhaps elsewhere. And I will leave you with these thoughts. We can have questions. And before I finish, I really must thank all of you who've been part of this lecture series. And of course, the Ambedkar King Circles, Kanak, Nalan, Karthik, the other friends who've sort of been there all through. And also the listeners, your thoughtful questions, your commitment to being here every morning. And I have really had to sort of reflect and think on some of the questions some of you raised during this session. And it's been a very fruitful and wonderful journey. And I want to sort of call out here my friend and comrade Revati, who's I think somewhere in the audience. Both of us often do something called the social justice events in April. And because of lockdown, we couldn't do this. And the Ambedkar King Circle gave us an opportunity to do that in another form. So Revati, thanks for being with me on this journey. And you know how important your comradeship has been. And thanks everybody else, Zamir, who has been part of the Prabuddha Collective, who also is engaged in a similar journey, and many other friends who are there. And so question time.